Hello. So I decided to combine these couple of sections addressing difficult topics with parents or families. So instead of splitting it apart, I just decided to put it all together like it's listed in the book. So we're going to cover academic topics, and remember these are all aimed toward our communicating issues related to these topics with parents or families. So academic, social, or behavioral issues, abuse or neglect, bullying, and then school crises. So with academic issues, what we're particularly talking about is when a student or child is not performing as expected. So that might be different depending on what grade you're or what level or age you are working with. If you end up in the early child care, like a child care facility, younger than the age of 3 or 4 or something like that, that's obviously going to look a lot different. But at any given point, developmentally or academically, you're kind of gauging for where the child is and basing what you perceive off of what you know about development and specifically through your learning in here at Upstate. So, given the child's age, their ability level, their developmental level, you're sort of always assessing for where they are. And so academic issues in this sense could be more like developmental issues also related to basic skills, and this kind of gets into what effect issues might have on the child. So in a general way, the basic skills of life and getting along with others might be, the child might be somewhat of a disadvantage or have a difficult time with. And then more specifically, later on, without early intervention or appropriate intervention, the dropout risk goes up, and the likelihood of having difficulty in work life later in life also increases. Some things that you can watch out for, and this does typically aim toward older grades. This book is not really specifically or narrowly describing early child care facilities or something. It does broaden out to upper grade levels as well. But when you are noticing particular types of behaviors, and it's really interesting with as you work with older children and they have academic issues, there seems to be this kind of polarization. So, meaning that there's one or the other type of extreme sort of thing you might notice. Either they could have this an attitude of defiance or an attitude of total compliance, just absolutely wanting to please and do whatever's asked of them. And in the same way, a sort of split can be seen with apathy, that just an uncaring attitude versus an almost over participation. So in either of those cases, that might be, not always, but it might be a sort of at-risk indicator, meaning that they're either basically giving up or just trying to win success by pleasing in a certain way. The way that you might support the child or family is thought of as having a shared responsibility. So that means that you, the person working with the child, wherever you might be in a classroom or another type of setting, you're going to have obviously a really major and direct impact, but also the parent, home environment, and the broader school environment or facility environment, it's going to have a lot to do with that too. And similar to that, the school climate is also a major impact. So the way that the school globally discusses how a child pursues academic success in older grades, for instance, will have a good trickle down to the individual level with each child. Now, when communicating with parents, again, this academic kind of portion is pointed to a little bit of an older grade. But when communicating with parents, it will be important to have an inviting and welcoming attitude for the parent or child or family member to participate in whatever form of communication you find most appropriate. So we've talked about that a couple of weeks ago. There being lots of different ways to communicate via email, phone call, formal meeting, informal conversation. And that'll be something you have to decide how to, which one of those paths to choose. So shifting to social and behavioral issues, these are types of things that you're going to see at all ages. The ways that children interact with each other and interact with other adults, and the ways that they conduct themselves is just something that you'll see, of course, in all stages of life. We interact with others and we behave in various ways. It's useful to think about broader categories of issues related to social or behavioral things, one being more an internalized and the other being more externalized. Internalized can be thought of as a way that a child might experience issues or difficulties related to social interaction or their own conduct that they themselves are the primary audience for. In other words, it's very difficult sometimes to notice internalized issues. Internalized issues are examples of like worry or stress or anxiety or feelings of lowered self-worth or sadness or depression, those things. And as opposed to externalized issues which have to do with maybe physical confrontation and aggression, with damaging properties, with meanness or unkindness to others. And these we can think of as being a very broad spectrum of things, ranging from fairly minor things like talking out of turn or being very, very reserved, and all the way out to overt disrespect, physical aggression, damage to property, things like that. I think it's useful to consider possible reasons for behavioral or conduct issues as being categorized into one of three types of purposes or reasons. These three things answer the question, basically, why is the child doing this, whether or not they know this is why they do this. One is for the sensory consequences or the sensory effects that basically think that it feels good, sounds good, or looks good in some ways outwardly to them. Very often it's feels good, so tactily or somatically, that means within the body, they receive sensation in the body that they like, and that's why it's done, okay? Another broader category is desired consequences. So they might, a child might produce a certain behavior that's not appropriate, but that they get something out of. That they either get attention from adults, even if it's negative attention, or attention from other children, or they could be trying to avoid undesired consequences. So it may distract the adult from having the child participate in the class activity in a different way. Maybe they're asked to sit out because because of something they've done, and the purpose of that for them would be to avoid what the rest of the class might be doing. Those are just some examples, but I think those are three really useful types of categories. Social or behavioral issues not intervened early on can lead to a lot of different concerns and issues that basically compound on one another. At the most extreme end, if behavioral social issues continue to worsen, dropout, substance use, even violent behaviors or more aggressive nonviolent behaviors can emerge in the child's life. There are, I like the way that this book categorized 5 different categories of potential at-risk indicators, things you might see in the person or the individual, in their home or family, in their peer interactions, in the teacher or classroom environment, or the school environment overall. And I'm not going to go down and break each of those down, but there's a really good chart in the book that kind of gives some idea about that. In terms of support, 3 levels, and I like this idea too. Global, school-wide, more localized, or regional, if you think of it locationally, at the small group level. That's when you're intervening with a subsection of kids who tend to be having the same types of issues. Or at a more extreme necessary case, we might highlight just the intervention with the individual and maybe with their family or some family members. Teams-based approach is best. Also, person-first communication, which we've talked about a lot before, but especially when related to communicating with parents, we definitely don't want to give them the impression that we're pointing to their child as being somehow bad or a bad kid, they're somehow set apart from others because of the way they behave. It's more like there's the child there, and then there are these types of more or less appropriate behaviors. Like I mentioned, probably based on something that the child gets out of the behavior that we can help them achieve in some other way. Now, on the topic of abuse and neglect, there is a lot to say about all of these little categories here, but abuse and neglect is one that you'll hopefully become more and more familiar with in terms of how you're going to screen for it and protect children through it. And honestly, hopefully it won't be something that you see a lot, because I'm saying that because I hope it doesn't happen to kids, but it undoubtedly will be something you'll deal with at some point or another. So specifically, what we mean by abuse and neglect is physical, emotional, sexual, and or psychological maltreatment of children. So there's lots of different examples of each of what those mean, but I think I'll just kind of leave it at that, and there's a little more explication in the text about what each of those means, but I think that might be kind of self-explanatory. The way that it impacts children maybe obviously could be very broad and very severe. In general, decreased likelihood of developmental, social, or emotional thriving might be how we think of the potential effect on children. That's a short statement, but a very broad implication. Developmental, social, or emotional thriving are really essential bedrocks of how a person begins their life as a young child, and abuse and neglect definitely shakes the integrity of those things. Some signs and reporting. There's a really good list of physical and behavioral signs in your book on table 5.4. I think that's really well worth looking over. I'm not going to go over each one of the little points there because they're really just a list of potential things. You'll develop a kind of red flag sense within yourself when you work with kids, and especially individual kids, and you get to know them to the point that you'll be able to spot out slight kind of red flag raising observations. And in general, what you should remember is that you will be a mandated reporter. A mandated reporter is anyone who works within proximity of children or dependent adults in their occupation. And what that implies is that they are obligated to report signs of suspicion of abuse or neglect. That doesn't mean that you have to prove it. It doesn't mean that you have to have irrefutable evidence. It just means that you have to report your own suspicion of abuse or neglect. It should be, you should trust your judgment, and you should also make sure that you're doing it for authentic reasons. When a report is made, the person with first-hand observational experience will have to be the one reporting. That means you, if you see something that you suspect might mean or imply abuse or neglect. That is the case even if you kind of go up the chain of command. You report it to your team leader, your principal, your guidance counselor at the facility where you might be working, or report it to a head therapist if you're working as a therapist or something. That's what you're supposed to do. That's fine. But you actually have to be the one to make the report to DSS or the reporting agency if you're the one who witnesses it or witnesses the behavior or physical sign that you're suspicious of. So with this is a very, very difficult and hairy thing to walk through. If a report is made, the family will be likely visited, interviewed, Other people in the child's life will be interviewed. And at a certain point, it may or may not be that the child's actually removed from the home to continue the investigation. And then there will be a decision made later on based on that investigation of what happens as a next step. In general, something that I think this entire course hopefully highlights for you is that the relationships that you develop with your children that you work with and their families is one of your greatest tools, and the way that you communicate with them within the relationship is the way that makes that tool functional. So relationships with the families will be really important to start off on the right foot, so that if anything like this happens, you can be a part of the healing for the child and the family. And also longer term, there's very often a high negative self-perception that the child has of themselves as a result of abuse or neglect. They basically think of themselves as being bad, of being damaged, of being no good, depending on the type of abuse or neglect that they may have endured. And that'll be something that you'll have to just, there's definitely no rule book on that or step-by-step process, but the relationships that you develop using the kind of self-awareness tools we've talked about, the communication tools we've talked about, will provide you the sort of groundwork to make those relationships work in a healing way. One note about communicating with parents: if you make a report, you should not contact the parents before you make the report. And if you make a report involving the parents' potential or your suspicion of the parents' potential abuse or neglect, you actually probably shouldn't communicate with them that much for a little while the report's beginning. If the report's being made about some adult or other older child outside of the parents, then you can definitely discuss or talk about things with the parents. But when an investigation is going on, you'll want to make sure that you're talking to the people that you need to, and not interfere with that. And regardless of who the report's made about, working with the parents moving forward will be based on that kind of relationship building that we talked about before. So with bullying is an intentional and repetitive mistreatment from one person to another, and it often involves an imbalance of power. So that can be child to child and peers, that can be child to child, older, younger, that can be adults, technically speaking, but we're really focusing on what it looks like with children. Different forms could be physical, that means that one person is harmed. Physically. Verbal, that means another person is harmed verbally or emotionally. Terrorizing is the use of fear to keep a person continually afraid. Isolation is the arrangement of relationships so that a child feels segregated and in solitude and isolated from others. Corrupting is basically manipulating in a relationship so that one child might lead another child away from good habits, for instance. An example is like repetitively making fun of a child for doing well in class, leading to the child maybe wanting to not do as well to look cool and things like that. And then cyberbullying is, you probably know what cyberbullying is, use of the internet or other means of telecommunication to enact that same type of power imbalance and mistreatment. It can have a lot of very severe side effects on the students, including psychological or emotional, or issues related to relationships and the child's social life. And there's been quite a lot of teen or adolescent suicides connected with bullying or cyberbullying. And so there's obviously a lot of cause for concern and should be a lot of effort to prevent. And the ways that we might do that include supported school by school-wide programs emphasizing the importance of non-bullying behaviors. And an example of that more locally in the school systems around Spartanburg is called Olveus. That looks like Olveus with a W, but the W's pronounced as a V, so Olveus. And also more on the classroom level, the classroom rules should reflect an attitude about bullying or attitude about peer-to-peer relationships that highlights the importance of respect and kindness and things like that. It's important to be prepared to deal with instances of bullying on the spot. So thinking about what you would be doing, how you would respond if you're witnessing bullying occur. That's a part of what, for instance, the Olveus training teaches children, is that if you're watching it happen and you don't do anything or very much at all, you're actually a part of the problem. And that being a bystander does not mean that you're an innocent bystander. It means that you're a participant, but you happen to be standing by watching. So as the adult, it's extra important not to just say, oh, stop that, sweep it under the rug, move on, and ignore any other things, but actually pausing and highlighting the fact that, no, this is actually bullying that's going on here. This is the reason why. These are things I'm seeing you do or you say, and point out the importance of that type of behavior being unacceptable in the school environment. Communicating with parents, like with a lot of other things, may include a lot of high emotion. If the parent feels like they're sending their child to school and that child is repeatedly being terrorized, it makes sense, and I think it's rightfully felt, that a parent will have a lot of high emotion and want to maybe even forcefully enact some change in their child's life at school. That's a place that the parents don't often feel they have a lot of control. And so meeting them with the skills of self-awareness and communication we've discussed could increase the chances that they'll feel felt with you, they'll feel heard and understood, and that they'll have some linkage between them and this environment of the school or child care facility that they aren't as familiar with as you. So lastly, we're going to talk just a minute about school crises. So there are 4 different types that the book we have outlines, and I think this is a good way to think about it. So death of an individual refers to death of a student, a faculty member, a teacher, or some figure in the community that whose death will majorly impact a lot of people at the school, a lot of the children at the school or facility. If that's the case, it needs to be addressed and handled in certain ways, and that'll have its own kind of protocol. Another is a major environmental crisis. That's hurricane, tornado, earthquake, fire, things like that. Physical threat can involve accidental threat of harm, like automobile accidents, like a bus accident. It can also involve intruder types of situations where physical threat might be involved, and fourthly, the 4th type of emotional threat. And what this refers to is maybe hate-related graffiti or repeated bomb threats. I think those are a couple examples that the book might even have given. I thought those were good ones. So things where students or children might feel a kind of fear that there is physical threat, even if there's not immediate physical threat. So those are 4 types. I think they're useful to think of in that way. With response and communication plans, it's important for each facility that houses children in some way or another to have plans of what to do in response to crises and what to do to communicate with each other internally and with others outside of the facility. So modes of communication should be set from the beginning, so knowing how people in the building are going to communicate with each other during the crisis, and how they're going to communicate outside to parents, family, other school administrators and things during and after the crisis. Resources should be set so that everyone has what they need to do to follow those modes of communication, and also to enact efforts of protection and things like that. And also, people have to have established roles. So each teacher or therapist or child care worker or school administrator should know what their job is if something would happen in any of those four types of school crises. In communicating with parents, parents might also have a crisis response role in terms of like a communication chain, like through phone, text, or email. Maybe parents could be a part of how to get everyone information they need. And parents will also be very much involved as a recovery figure. So that means that with their own child, they'll be highly active in a role of recovery with their own child. And they might even participate in some efforts at the facility itself in more of a school-wide or facility-wide kind of recovery effort. Okay, so those are, in a kind of whirlwind, quick pass, a lot of the, at some categories of a lot of difficult issues that can come up when working with young children and their families, and a little bit about how to communicate with them about that. I've only posted one assignment related to interaction with parents related to a very difficult or sensitive topic. And as we're getting to the end of the term here, you're having your kind of major assignments coming up, being due or having been due. So take any time you might spend on other assignments that I might normally give to try to be on top of that, ready for your research paper, the communication, the family involvement and communication plan, and the role playing that will be involved in that. And I've had a couple of clarifying questions about it. Do your best to reach out to me as soon as you can if you have any question about what that last class meeting is going to look like. Just to give you a quick reminder, I'm going to ask you to present, but not quite to demonstrate the activity that I've asked you to create. So the clinical experience that we were going to facilitate at the Fall Festival at the Ida Thompson Center. I don't want you to bring in the materials and lead us through it. We won't really have time for that. But I would like for you to just describe the activity you've designed and talk about how it ties in either communication or emotion or empathy or music, one of those three or more than one of those three categories. And also in our last class meeting, we'll actually be doing role plays. That means we're kind of acting out or pretending to be in a parent-teacher type of conference or a professional family member conference, discussing some issue related to a child's involvement at the facility that you'll be working at, whatever that is, or some problem in their family life or home life or something. And that'll be something that you kind of create through your family involvement plan, the written portion that I'd like for you to bring with you in a hard copy if you can to that last class meeting. And then we'll spend a few minutes acting out where you'll be the professional and either I'll be the family member or if you choose to ask a classmate to do it with you, you can do that. And you'll basically, as the teacher, you'll be walking through and leading a conference based on the plan that you've written up and addressing certain concerns that might come up. So the thing I'm concerned about watching for or listening for is to hear how you bring in some ways those skills of self-awareness, skills of communication, and of maintaining a professional stance in real time, and that's kind of live role playing. So I've not listed that you need to show X number of those skills or any particular ones, but I am going to be listening for them to try to highlight them for myself and to talk about them with you so that what we've talked about can translate into a kind of natural conversation with people. I believe that's about it. Research paper, of course, is going to be due around that time too. I think it gave you one extra day to do that. But I think that's all I was going to remind you about, so get in touch with me with any other clarifications.